52 BC. In the hills of ancient Gaul, a small hilltop town became the center of the most dangerous gamble in military history. Julius Caesar stood there with just 50,000 tired soldiers, deep in enemy territory. Ahead of him were 80,000 warriors inside a powerful fortress. Behind him, an even bigger army was gathering to wipe him out. No safe retreat, no reinforcements, no second chances. One mistake, and Rome would lose Gaul forever. Most commanders would have tried to escape. Some would have begged for peace. Caesar chose something else. He didn't prepare for a battle. He prepared for a siege that would trap himself. With nothing but discipline, shovels, and steel, he decided to build his own prison and turn it into a weapon. This is the story of the day Rome survived the impossible. Our story kicks off in 52 BC. For 6 years, Gaius Julius Caesar had been campaigning across Gaul, a vast territory that's roughly modern-day France and Belgium. Through a relentless grind of battles and sieges, he had brought dozens of fiercely independent Gallic tribes, one by one, under Roman control. As far as Rome was concerned, Gaul was nearly pacified, just another territory to add to the Republic's collection. But under that fragile surface of Roman order, resentment was boiling. The Gauls, a proud and warlike people, were tired of Roman legions taking their food, drafting their young men, and tearing apart their way of life. That resentment was about to explode into a full-blown rebellion, and the man holding the torch was Vercingetorix, a charismatic young nobleman from the Arverni tribe. Vercingetorix had something few Gallic leaders before him did: a vision of a unified Gallic nation, free from Roman rule. He was a brilliant strategist and a magnetic leader. In the early months of 52 BC, he pulled off the unthinkable. He united the endlessly bickering tribes of Gaul into a massive coalition against their common enemy. The Great Rebellion had begun. Vercingetorix's strategy was brutally effective. He knew he couldn't beat Caesar's legions in a straight-up fight. The Romans were just too disciplined and well-organized. So he launched a scorched earth campaign. He convinced his own people to burn their towns, destroy their crops, and abandon their villages. Anything to deny the perpetually hungry Roman army the supplies it needed to operate. His goal was to starve Caesar out, to wear down his legions with guerrilla raids and relentless harassment until they were forced into a humiliating retreat. And it was working. At the fortified town of Gergovia, Vercingetorix handed Caesar one of his very few and very public military defeats. Roman legions, trying to storm the fortress, were thrown back with heavy losses. It was a huge victory for the Gauls and a massive blow to Caesar's reputation. For a moment, it looked like the whole Roman project in Gaul might actually collapse. Alliances started to fray, and the rebellion grew. Vercingetorix had Caesar on the run, but Caesar was not a man you underestimate. His defining trait was a relentless, almost frightening adaptability. Beaten at Gergovia, he regrouped. Realizing his own Gallic cavalry was a weak link, he did something unorthodox. He hired thousands of elite Germanic horsemen from across the Rhine, fearsome warriors known for their skill and ferocity. He pulled his forces together, and then he went hunting, not for another fortress, but for a fight on his own terms. The two armies finally met near the Vinjan River. Vercingetorix, brimming with confidence after Gergovia, threw his cavalry at Caesar's marching column. He didn't count on the Germans. In a furious, decisive clash, Caesar's new mercenaries shattered the Gallic horsemen. It was a devastating blow. Vercingetorix's greatest advantage, his superior cavalry, was gone. His strategy of hit and run was no longer an option. Forced to pivot, he made a fateful choice. He would retreat with his entire army of 80,000 warriors to the hill fort of Alesia, a stronghold of the Mandubi tribe. He planned to make his stand there, convinced its mighty defenses could keep Caesar occupied, while he summoned a new, massive relief army from all over Gaul to finally crush the Romans. Alesia wasn't just a fortress, it was a trap, and Caesar, sensing a final decisive battle, marched right into it. When Caesar's legions arrived at Alesia, they immediately saw why Vercingetorix had chosen it. The place was a natural fortress. The town sat on a high, steep plateau, looming 500 feet over the landscape. Two rivers, the Osse and the Osserine, flowed along its base. A 3-mile plain stretched out in front, but on every other side, Alesia was surrounded by hills of equal height, creating a natural amphitheater for war. A direct assault was suicide, and Caesar had learned that bloody lesson already at Gergovia. Inside Alesia's walls, Vercingetorix had his 80,000 warriors, plus the town's civilian population. Critically, he had gathered enough food and supplies to last about 30 days. That 30-day clock was the heart of his entire strategy. He was betting that was more than enough time for his call to arms to echo across Gaul and for a massive relief army to march to his rescue. The plan was simple, and on paper, it was brilliant. He would use his 80,000 men and the walls of Alesia to pin Caesar's 50,000 soldiers in place. The Romans would have to lay siege, but while they were busy trying to contain him, the real hammer would fall. A second, much larger Gallic army would arrive and smash into the Romans from behind. Caesar's legions would be caught in a vice, crushed between Vercingetorix's army charging out of Alesia and the huge relief force attacking from the outside. The besiegers would become the besieged. It was a perfect trap, designed to wipe out the Roman presence in Gaul for good. Vercingetorix felt confident. He had a huge army, an incredible defensive position, and had just proved that Caesar wasn't invincible. He watched as the Romans set up their camps and started surveying the land. He knew Caesar had two choices: retreat in disgrace, his campaign in ruins, or commit to a siege that would surely become his tomb. Caesar, however, had no intention of retreating. He looked at the towering hill of Alesia, considered the 80,000 warriors watching him from its walls, and listened to his scouts report that all of Gaul was mobilizing against him. He knew a relief army wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty. He was outnumbered from the front, and he was about to be catastrophically outnumbered from the rear. Any other general would have seen an impossible situation. Caesar saw an opportunity. He was a gambler, and he was about to make the biggest bet of his life. He wasn't just going to besiege Alesia. He was going to wall off his own army from the entire world. His response wasn't caution. It was breathtaking, almost insane audacity. He gave the order. His men were to start digging. Caesar's plan was as simple in its idea as it was massive in its execution. If he couldn't take Alesia by force, he'd starve it out. To do that, he needed a perfect, unbreakable blockade. This was the first piece of his grand engineering puzzle, the circumvallation. It would be an 11-mile, about 18 kilometers ring of fortifications facing inward, completely sealing off Alesia and trapping Vercingetorix's army inside. For a Roman legionary, this was just another day at the office, albeit a very long one. The Roman army wasn't just a fighting force, it was a mobile construction company. Every single soldier was a trained laborer who expected to dig trenches and build walls as part of his daily duties. But what Caesar was asking for now was on a whole different level. This wasn't a temporary marching camp. This was the construction of a permanent fortress, all while under the constant threat of attack. The legionaries got to work with their standard tools, the dalabra, a type of pickaxe, shovels, and baskets for hauling away earth. The scale was mind-boggling. The circumvallation started with a massive trench, 20 feet wide and just as deep, with sheer vertical sides. This was the main obstacle, designed to stop any sudden charge from the fortress. But it was just the beginning. Behind this main trench, they dug 2 more ditches, each about 15 feet wide. The innermost one was flooded with water diverted from the nearby rivers, creating a moat. The dirt from all this digging was piled up to create a huge rampart, an earth and timber wall 12 feet high. On top of that wall, they built a wooden palisade for cover and then studded the entire 11-mile line with towers every 80 feet or so. These towers were packed with Roman artillery, ballistae, which were giant crossbows that fired heavy bolts, and scorpiones, smaller, more precise weapons that acted like ancient sniper rifles. The line was backed up by 23 larger forts, called redoubts, to act as command posts. Vercingetorix didn't just sit and watch this giant prison being built around him. He launched constant cavalry attacks, trying to disrupt the work and break the Roman lines before they could close the circle. These were brutal, bloody fights, but Caesar's new Germanic cavalry proved their worth, smashing every Gallic charge and driving them back. As the Roman walls drew tighter, Vercingetorix knew his time was running out. Before the last gap was closed, he made his most critical move. Under the cover of night, he sent his entire cavalry force slipping through the gap in the Roman lines. Their mission was desperate: ride to every corner of Gaul, spread the word of the siege, and summon the great relief army he was counting on. With his horsemen gone, Vercingetorix and his 80,000 infantry were now completely and utterly trapped. The first wall was complete. Now, all they could do was wait, watch their food run out, and pray that help would arrive in time. With the inner wall finished, Vercingetorix was sealed inside Alesia. Problem 1 solved, but Caesar knew the second, much bigger problem was already on its way. His spies confirmed that Vercingetorix's cavalry had succeeded. A massive relief army was being gathered. Ancient sources, probably exaggerating a bit, claimed a staggering 250,000 warriors were coming. Even more realistic modern estimates suggest a force of at least 100,000 to 150,000 men. Either way, Caesar's army of around 50,000 was about to be outnumbered by at least 2 to 1, and maybe as much as 5 to 1. They were caught, trapped between 80,000 Gauls in Alesia and this enormous army approaching from the outside. Logic dictated a retreat, but Caesar did the opposite. He did the unthinkable. He ordered his men to build another wall. This was the contravallation, a second line of fortifications, this one facing outward, designed to protect his army from the coming relief force. Essentially, Caesar was deliberately building his army into the very trap Vercingetorix had planned. His legions were now sandwiched between 2 enemy armies, with their backs to one wall and their faces to another. It remains one of the most audacious, high-stakes decisions in military history. This outer wall was even longer than the first, running for about 14 miles, or 21 kilometers. It was a mirror image of the inner fortifications. More massive trenches, another towering rampart crowned with a palisade, and more artillery towers. This created a fortress around a fortress, a self-contained Roman zone stretching for miles across the French countryside. The sheer logistics are hard to wrap your head around. Tens of thousands of men worked day and night, clearing forests for timber and moving millions of cubic feet of earth, all while keeping a constant watch on the walls of Alesia. The entire project, both inner and outer walls, a combined 25 miles of heavy fortifications, was completed in a matter of weeks. It's still considered one of the most incredible feats of military engineering in history. As the last stakes were hammered into place, the Roman position was set. They were both besiegers and besieged. They were trapped, but they were trapped inside a fortress of their own making. Inside this corridor of death, Caesar arranged his legions and his precious cavalry. He had established interior lines, which meant he could rush troops from one wall to the other to respond to threats, a critical advantage for the two-front war he knew was about to begin. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait. The food inside Alesia was running out. The massive Gallic army was getting closer every day. The air crackled with tension. The stage was set for a battle of unimaginable scale, one that would be fought not just with swords and spears, but with ditches, towers, and a horrifying array of hidden traps. Caesar's defensive strength wasn't just in his high walls and deep ditches. It was in the horrifyingly clever layers of traps he set up in the space between them. The ground in front of both the inner and outer walls was turned into a multi-layered killing field, a nightmare landscape designed to maim, impale, and demoralize anyone who dared to attack. Caesar himself, in his own writings, describes these traps with a chillingly matter-of-fact tone. First, an attacking Gaul would run into a field of what the Romans called stimuli. These were basically ancient caltrops, sharp, barbed iron hooks embedded in short wooden stakes, scattered thickly across the ground and camouflaged. They were designed to pierce the feet of men and horses, causing terrible wounds and throwing charging formations into chaos. The psychological effect was just as important. The ground itself had become the enemy. If an attacker made it through the stimuli, they'd next find the lilia, or lilies. This was a bit of grim Roman humor, as the traps were laid out like flower beds. They were 3-foot-deep pits, dug in a staggered, checkerboard pattern. At the bottom of each pit was a single, fire-hardened, sharpened stake pointing straight up. The pits were then covered with brush and leaves, making them invisible. A warrior running forward in the heat of battle would suddenly plunge into the ground, only to be brutally impaled. It was a terrifyingly effective man-trap. Beyond the lilies lay the sipi, or tombstones. These were 5 parallel trenches, each 5 feet deep. Driven into the bottom were the thick branches and trunks of trees, with all their smaller branches sharpened into a dense, interlocking web of spikes. They were impossible to just pull out of the way. To get through the sipi, an attacker would have to pick their way through a man-made forest of sharpened wood, all while being showered with missiles from the Roman walls. Only after surviving this gauntlet of terror would an attacker finally reach the main fortifications. The massive 20-foot trench, the flooded moat, and the 12-foot-high rampart topped with towers and palisades. Every piece of this system was designed to do one thing: break the momentum of an assault, spread fear and confusion, and hold the enemy at a distance where they could be systematically slaughtered by Roman artillery and javelins. This entire system of walls and traps faced both inwards towards Vercingetorix and outwards, awaiting the relief army. It was a testament to the methodical, almost industrial, Roman approach to war. They didn't just build a wall, they engineered a machine designed for killing, and soon that machine would be put to the ultimate test. The wait finally ended in late September. Roman lookouts spotted a vast cloud of dust on the horizon. The Gallic relief army was here, led by a council of 4 prominent chieftains, including Commius of the Atrebates and Vercingetorix's own cousin, Vercingetorix. A massive host made camp on a hill just a mile from Caesar's outer wall. The sight must have been both terrifying and magnificent. Tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of warriors, representing the unified might of Gaul, had come to break the siege. From the walls of Alesia, Vercingetorix and his men could see their salvation, and a great roar must have gone up from the fortress. For the Romans, hunkered down between their two walls, this was the moment of truth. They were now officially biased. The next day, the relief army deployed for battle on the plain, a spectacular show of force. They dared Caesar to come out and fight. But Caesar didn't take the bait. He wasn't giving up his fortifications. He would fight this battle on his own terms. Frustrated, the Gauls launched their first major assault. A fierce battle exploded as warriors surged toward the outer wall. They charged headlong into the killing fields, where Caesar's deadly traps immediately took their toll. Men screamed as they were impaled on hidden stakes or had their feet pierced by iron hooks. But their sheer numbers allowed them to push on, filling the first Roman trench and probing the lines for any weakness. At the same time, alerted by the noise from outside, Vercingetorix launched his own coordinated attack from inside Alesia. His men swarmed out of the fortress, attacking the inner wall. The Romans were now fighting the two-front war they knew was coming. The air was filled with war cries, the thud of sling stones, the hiss of arrows, and the screams of the wounded. Caesar's genius in this moment was his use of interior lines. From his central command post, he could see the entire battle. He coolly directed his commanders, Mark Antony and Gaius Trebonius, moving legions like chess pieces from quiet sections of the wall to wherever the fighting was heaviest. The artillery crews in the towers rained down a constant storm of heavy bolts and stones, breaking up Gallic formations. The fighting raged from noon until sunset. The Gauls fought with incredible courage, but they couldn't break through. The Roman defenses and the discipline of the men holding them were just too strong. As darkness fell, the Gauls, having taken horrific losses, were forced to retreat. The first storm had passed, but everyone knew it was just a prelude. The Gauls had now seen the Roman fortifications up close. They wouldn't make the same mistakes again. They would find a new plan, one aimed at a single decisive point. After that first failed assault, the Gallic commanders scouted Caesar's entire 14-mile outer perimeter, looking for a weakness, and they found one. To the north, the Roman lines went over a large hill where the rugged terrain had stopped the Romans from building their defenses to the same insane standard as on the plains. This was the weak point. This was where they would focus their final, all-or-nothing attack. The Gallic plan was brilliant. Under the cover of night, Vercingetorix, Vercingetorix's cousin, took 60,000 of the best Gallic warriors on a long, silent march around the Roman lines to get behind that hill, totally hidden from view. The plan was to launch a surprise attack on this weak spot at dawn. To maximize the pressure, the main relief army would launch a massive diversionary attack on the plains, while Vercingetorix, signaled by the noise, would lead his 80,000 men in a simultaneous, full-scale assault on the inner wall. It was a perfectly coordinated, three-pronged attack designed to finally overwhelm the Romans. As the sun rose, the trap was sprung. The main Gallic army surged forward on the plain, pinning down the Roman defenders. From inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's starving warriors poured out, desperately trying to scale the inner wall. And then, from the north, war horns announced the main attack. Vercingetorix's 60,000 warriors stormed over the hill and crashed down on the weakest point of the Roman line. The Roman legionaries in that sector were immediately in deep trouble. They were hopelessly outnumbered, and the Gauls began tearing down the fortifications and filling in the trenches. The fighting was savage and hand-to-hand. Caesar rushed his top lieutenant, Titus Labienus, with nearly 3,000 men to reinforce the crumbling line. But even that wasn't enough. Labienus sent a desperate message to Caesar. The line was about to break. The Romans were stretched to their absolute limit. All along the 25 miles of walls, men were fighting for their lives. On one side, they were trying to keep the relief army out. On the other, they were trying to keep the starving army in. Vercingetorix's men, fighting with the desperation of trapped animals, even managed to topple a Roman tower with grappling hooks. The entire audacious gamble of Alesia was hanging by a thread. The fortress between two armies was about to shatter. It was at this moment of pure crisis that Caesar made his move. With his lines on the verge of collapse, Caesar rode to a high point where he could see the whole battle. He could see Labienus's northern sector buckling. He could see the desperate fights all along both walls. His grand strategy was failing. It was time for the general to become a soldier. He made sure everyone saw him. He put on his famous scarlet cloak, a commander's cloak that every one of his soldiers would instantly recognize. He wanted his men to see him, to know their general was right there with them in the thick of it. He rode along the lines, rallying his exhausted troops, shouting that this was it, the final battle for their survival and the glory of Rome. First, he galloped to the threatened parts of the inner wall, leading a small reserve to push back Vercingetorix's attack. His arrival was like a lightning bolt, inspiring his men to surge forward and drive the Gauls back from the ramparts. But the real crisis was still in the north, where Labienus was about to be overrun. Caesar knew just sending more men into that meat grinder wasn't enough. He needed to do something decisive. He gathered his very last reserves, about 4 cohorts, and, most importantly, ordered his entire force of Germanic cavalry to follow him. But he didn't ride straight to reinforce Labienus. Instead, he led his men on a wide, fast flanking march, completely outside his own walls. He was going around the battle, unseen, to get behind the attackers. It was an incredibly risky move, but it was his last chance. Just as he was circling around, Labienus's line finally broke. The exhausted Romans fell back, and the Gauls roared in triumph as they poured through the breach. At that exact moment, Caesar and his cavalry appeared over a rise, directly at their rear. The Gauls were caught completely by surprise. They were so focused on the enemy in front that they never imagined an attack from behind. The sound of Roman trumpets blaring from their rear sent a shockwave of panic through their ranks. Caesar's infantry charged into their disorganized lines, while the terrifying Germanic cavalry screamed their war cries and slammed into their flank. From the walls of Alesia, Vercingetorix and his men watched in horror as their salvation was wiped out. They saw the great relief army, their last hope, break and scatter. The slaughter was immense as Roman cavalry pursued them for miles. The dream of a free Gaul died on that plain. For the men inside Alesia, already weak from starvation, the psychological blow was final. There was no more hope. A grim silence fell over the battlefield. The siege was over. One of the siege's most tragic moments had happened even before this final battle. With food running out, the Gauls inside Alesia made a ruthless decision. To conserve food for the warriors, they expelled all non-combatants, the women, children, and elderly of the Mandubii tribe who actually lived in Alesia. They sent these thousands of civilians toward the Roman lines, hoping Caesar would take them as captives and feed them. But Caesar, with his own supplies stretched thin, gave an equally ruthless order: don't let them in. Trapped in the no-man's land between the two armies, these innocent people slowly and agonizingly starved to death, a silent, horrific testament to the brutal calculus of ancient war. The day after the battle, Vercingetorix called his war council. He told his chieftains that he had fought for the freedom of Gaul, not for himself, and now they were beaten. He put his fate in their hands. They could kill him to appease the Romans or surrender him alive. They chose surrender. Envoys were sent to Caesar, who demanded they lay down their arms and hand over their leaders. The scene that followed has become legendary. Vercingetorix, the proud chieftain who had united a nation, prepared for his final act. Accounts vary, but the most dramatic tells of him putting on his finest armor, mounting his horse, and riding out of Alesia alone. He rode to the Roman camp where Caesar sat on a tribunal, circled him once, then dismounted. Without a word, he threw his weapons, his sword, his helmet, his javelins, at Caesar's feet. The great Gallic rebellion was over. Vercingetorix was taken away in chains. He would be held in a Roman prison for 6 years, waiting for his conqueror's official victory parade. In 46 BC, he was paraded through the streets of Rome as the ultimate prize of the Gallic Wars, before being privately strangled in his cell, a common fate for defeated enemy leaders. The Battle of Alesia was the final, decisive blow that crushed organized Gallic resistance. For the next couple of years, Roman legions conducted mopping-up operations, but the dream of an independent Gaul was gone forever. The region was absorbed into the Roman world, where it would remain for centuries, its resources and people fueling the engine of the empire. For Julius Caesar, Alesia was the crowning achievement of his military career. The conquest of Gaul brought him incredible wealth and the unwavering loyalty of a battle-hardened army. The legions that built the walls of Alesia and held them against impossible odds would follow Caesar anywhere, even across the Rubicon River a few years later, which would start the civil war that ended with Caesar as the master of Rome. In military history, the Siege of Alesia stands as a masterclass in engineering, logistics, and leadership under extreme pressure. Caesar's audacious decision to build a fortress between two armies and his personal leadership at the moment of crisis are still studied by military strategists today. But the legacy of Alesia is complicated. While it represents the peak of Roman military power, it also marks the birth of a powerful national symbol. Vercingetorix, the defeated chieftain, was eventually rediscovered and transformed into a founding hero of France, a romantic icon of resistance against overwhelming power. The fields around modern-day Issy-Saint-Reine in France still bear the faint scars of Caesar's massive earthworks, the ghostly outlines of the walls and ditches that decided the fate of a nation. They're a quiet reminder of a time when 50,000 men, trapped and outnumbered, didn't retreat, but picked up their shovels and built their way to one of the most improbable and important victories in the history of the world.